What's up, YouTube? 大家好, minasan konnichiwa. This is Ben Parker back with another video about my journey learning Chinese and Japanese. Today's topic is whether or not studying Chinese helps with studying Japanese. So, if you've watched some of my videos, you should already know that I've been studying Chinese for 3 years. 我学了中文3年了, and I've been studying Japanese for 1 year. 私勉強日本語が1年. And while I was in Japan last year with my Obasan and Oji-san, so Obasan means aunt, Oji-san means uncle, in Japan, I decided I'd start learning Japanese as well. So, 私の Obasan コチ人 desu. 私の Oji-san American desu. So my aunt is from Kochi. She is from Kochi, Japan. And my uncle is from America. So, like I am, right? So that's the connection I have to Japanese. And an amazing time in Japan with them last year. And figured, what the hey, I'm going to start doing Japanese as well as Chinese. So, and I'll be honest, at first, I thought that, get this down a little bit. I thought I was crazy to even, consider trying, Japanese on top of Chinese, just because they're very different languages in a lot of ways. And, they're not, they're both language isolates from each other. So in other words, that means, Japanese is part of its own language family, and Chinese is part of its own language family. So they're not related in that way at all. So it's really like starting from scratch all over again. I was like, do I want to start from scratch again with another Asian language? But I decided to go for it. And part of the reason for why I decided to go for it, aside from the fact that I just love Japan, I thought Japan was an awesome place, and I want to go back and visit and learn more about it. And in addition to going to China and Taiwan and using my Chinese there, what really kind of motivated me to start doing Japanese was the fact that I saw more similarities between Chinese and Japanese after having studied Chinese than I thought I would than I expected that I would see. Okay, I didn't realize that I was in Japan, for example, that there be so many kanji, which are Chinese characters that are important to the Japanese language. I had no idea that I would see that many kanji and whatnot. So, anyway, so in this video, I'm going to share kind of five wugu five things that I think help one learning Chinese study Japanese. Okay, yeah, so let's get into it. The first thing, the first area where studying Chinese helps with Japanese is with kanji. So kanji are Chinese characters that are imported into the Japanese language. Okay, and where the term kanji comes from is kanji is the onyomi, which is the Chinese-based pronunciation in Japanese for Chinese characters. Right. So in Mandarin you would call it hanzi, and in Japanese you call it kanji. Okay, so that's where the term kanji comes from. It comes from hanzi. Okay, it comes from that pronunciation. Actually, it doesn't come directly from hanzi. It comes from something that sounds a lot like hanzi, because the Chinese that the Japanese were hearing back when they were in contact with China a lot and were developing all this, was actually a lot more similar to Cantonese than it is to Mandarin. So that's one interesting thing I've kind of noticed, is that Cantonese pronunciation of characters is actually more similar to the onyomi than the Mandarin. One easy example is the word for big, which in Mandarin is da, and in Cantonese it's dai, and in Japanese the onyomi for big is dai. Same thing. So there's other similarities. There's other onyomi that are like same thing. It's closer to Cantonese, but fun fact: if you know Cantonese, if you learn Cantonese, I think you'd have an even easier time learning Japanese, at least when it comes to the onyomi part. But yeah, so the first part, as I said, is the kanji, what I call the kanji crossover, right? So in other words, Chinese characters that are also used in Japanese. Okay, and most of the time they have the same meaning. There are cases in which pairs of kanji going together don't mean the same thing as they do in Chinese. So, for example, when I introduce myself in Chinese to all of you, I say 大家好. So, 大家means everyone in Chinese, but if you put those characters together in Japanese, it means landlord in Japanese. So, things like that. So, there are some differences that you got to be aware of. But still, the characters mean the same thing, big, and then house. So I mean, I don't want to get into that, but the point is that if you study Chinese, you're forced to dive into characters immediately, because that's all that Chinese uses, whereas Japanese uses two additional writing systems called hiragana and katakana, which are like alphabetical scripts, basically. And so if you start with Chinese first, then you immediately just start diving into Hanzi, kanji, and learning them, because that's all that's used in Chinese, in terms of the written language. So then when you start going to Japanese, for example, you already learn a lot. You already know a lot of kanji. And so in a way, while you're learning Chinese, even though you're not really thinking about it, you are learning Japanese in a way through the kanji. So the kanji crossover, I like to call it, the crossover between, the fact that both Chinese and Japanese use the same characters in their in their written language, I think is a huge benefit you have going for you as you start learning Japanese if you studied Chinese first. Okay, and the second part of that is what I kind of mentioned earlier, which is the fact that in Japanese, each kanji has multiple pronunciations, and one of the pronunciations is modeled after the Chinese way of saying it, and the other is modeled after the more kind of traditional Japanese way of saying it. And so yeah, so if you know Chinese, the onyomi will sound very familiar to you. Just example I did, da versus dai, right? And then in the Cantonese is even more similar, dai. Another example is like shan means mountain in Mandarin, and in Japanese the onyomi for that is san. So no tone there, but san. So just things like that. So the crossover between the kanji is a big thing that helps with that will help you as you go from learning Chinese to trying to tackle Japanese. Just knowing those kanji, knowing those Hanzi, those Chinese characters, major plus for you. Number two, the argodongshi, the second thing, is pronunciation. So pronunciation is really, really 非常重要在中文, like 发音非常重要, like pronunciation is super important. Like you have to pronounce the tones right. In Mandarin, it's kind of scary because like the words ma, all mean different things, right? All have different meanings. Just because the tone, the word ma is the same, but the tone is different, and that changes the meaning of the word. So Chinese really forces you to like really be, forces you to be really precise with your pronunciation. And with Japanese, you don't have tone to worry about. You do have what's called pitch accent. So sometimes you kind of raise your tone sometimes. So like, for example, the days of the week in Japanese is Monday is getsuyobi, Tuesday is kayobi, suyobi, mokuyobi, kinyobi, doyobi, nichiyobi. And that yobi part is kind of a pitch accent, kind of rising, right? And that's what that's called. And so it's not the same as tone, but in order to sound authentic Japanese, you got to use your pitch accents accordingly. So you can't just say, oh, getsuyobi. You got to say getsuyobi, raise it, right? So for days of the week. So just by studying Chinese and learning a tonal language first, Japanese pronunciation is going to seem a lot easier after coming from Chinese. So that's the second one. So first one is kanji. Second is pronunciation. That's definitely something that will help with Japanese, having studied Chinese. The third thing is particles. Okay, so this is another thing that I think helps if you start learning Chinese first. And by the way, like I think the particle one is some. Well, I'll get into this a little later, but the particle one is something that could help from both ways. So if you were learning Japanese first, and then you start learning Chinese, the particle situation, I think you would find to help you with Chinese as well if you started Japanese. But coming from Chinese to Japanese, knowing particle words and the concept of particle words makes Japanese easier. You're already used to that. So what's an easy example of that? Well, so there's a particle word you use when you're asking a question. Okay, in Chinese it's ma, nichotan. Okay, so like if I were to ask somebody, do you like, I'm trying to think of an example. Yeah, okay. So let's say if I'm going to ask somebody in Chinese if they speak Chinese. So let's say I'm in like China right now, and I'm asking someone, "Oh, can you speak Chinese?" So that'd be a really weird question. Okay, well, just roll with it. So, or let's say I'm like in the States, I'm asking someone if they speak Chinese. I would say, "Oh, 你会说中文吗?" Right? So like, can you speak Chinese? Right? If you notice, I use the word "ma" to make it a question. Right? So 你会说中文吗? And many other kind of questions. Every kind of like question of this nature. If you ask somebody a question, you say ma, right? So like 喜欢吗? Do you like it? Right? 喜欢吗? Um, 这是你的吗? Is this yours? Right? Things like that. So the ma part makes it a question. Well, in Japanese, to make something a question, you add ka. Even rhymes with ma. Ka. So like if I were to say if they speak Japanese, I would say Nihongo ga dekimasu ka? Do you speak Japanese? Or if I were to ask somebody like, do you like it? Suki desu ka? Do you like it? You know, or if I was to ask in Chinese like, is it expensive? I would say 很贵吗? Like, is it expensive? 贵吗?很贵吗?这个东西很贵吗? And if I was to say that in Japanese, I would say これ高いですか? Like, is this expensive? Like, does this have a high price? Right? So instead of saying ma, it's ka in Japanese, but you just get used to that. So that's one kind of way that you kind of, and it's the concept of, okay, I got to attach this word to make it a question. That concept is consistent in both languages. And that's not something that happens in English, right? So in English, when we ask a question, we don't have a particle word. We inflect our voice, right? So if I would say like, if I would say, oh, that's a truck? That's a question mark. That's a truck? That because I inflected my voice, that made it a question, right? But in Chinese and Japanese, there's actual particle words you use. And it's not just with questions, but there's also examples of there's also particle words you use to indicate emphasis. Right? So if I was to say something is really expensive in Chinese, like I would say, oh, 太贵了, like too expensive, right? And if I was to say something is too expensive in Japanese, I could say 高いですよ, like that's really expensive, right? So yo kind of being the same thing as la. Now I'm not saying la and yo mean the same thing, they don't, but in that instance, both la and yo are being used as emphasis, right? So that's another kind of key way. Or like if I was to say like my uncle, right? So if I would say my uncle in Japanese, I would say watashi no oji-san, and if I was to say that in Chinese, I would say watashi. I would say in Chinese, I would say 我的九世, right? That's how I'd say my uncle in Chinese, right? Now, just to be clear, there's many ways to say uncle in Chinese. Depends on like which mom's side, dad's side. But like, in terms of my uncle that did his LDS mission in Japan, I would call him 我的九世, okay? And then my aunt would be 我的舅妈, right? And then in Japanese, that would be watashi no obasan. So the no and da, both particle words indicate possession there, for example, like that's a consistency. That's a consistent kind of similarity that Chinese and Japanese share. So particle words, both there, present. And then another one is, fourth thing is cultural similarity. So I think if you start learning Chinese, that helps with Japanese just because there's elements of both. There's elements of Chinese culture that are similar to Japanese culture. Both respect for the elders and then just in that kind of thing. People in China like anime, things like that. There's some kind of cultural kind of crossover. And then just, the fact that like Japanese uses Chinese characters, that's a huge one right there. I mean, so just like there's been a lot of like cultural kind of cultural exchange between the two. And there are different things about the cultures that are different. Like, Japanese are traditionally like, more polite and maybe more kind of serious and reserved, whereas in Chinese are a bit more lively and outgoing, maybe. So there are definite like differences between Chinese and Japanese culture, but there's still a lot of similarities there. And then the last thing, the fifth thing is by studying Chinese, you're already getting used to an Asian language, right? And more broadly speaking, you're getting used to just studying a foreign language. So people say that the more foreign languages you learn and study, the better you get at them. And I think that's certainly true. But with Chinese and Japanese, kind of for all the reasons I said, if you started learning Chinese, then you're already speaking an Asian language. And as such, there's some just elements of Japanese that are going to be familiar to you. The kanji is going to be familiar to you. The particles are going to be familiar to you. The concept of particles be familiar to you. The importance of pronunciation is going to be there for you. And then the fact too that you're going to have to get used to words that sound nothing like their English words. Now in Japanese, one kind of thing that is interesting is Japanese has more loan words, a lot of which are from Dutch, but those sound similar to English, like kohi for coffee, things like that. And then Mandarin coffee is cafe. But like there's a lot more of those loan words in Japanese, which is kind of interesting. But still, even with those loan words, like there's just, both Chinese and Japanese, like, man, there's like so many words that you have to learn that sound nothing like what they mean in English, right? Like there's nothing in ni hao, for example, a basic hello greeting that sounds like hello, right? Or konnichiwa. So konnichiwa sounds nothing like hello, right? Or like suki means to like in Japanese, and Xihuan means to like in Chinese. Like suki, Xihuan don't sound anything like, right? Like there's just nothing you're gonna say. Goodbye in Japanese, sayonara, and goodbye in Chinese is zaijian, right? So like, just they sound very different, right? But then like, what's interesting is like, bye bye means goodbye in both, right? So there's some things they kind of share each other a little bit, but bottom line is by studying Chinese first and then going to Japanese, you're going to see these similarities. You're going to see these things. And while they're very different languages and they're not the same, and, in a lot of ways, you got to like double the effort to learn them. I'm doubling my Chinese and I'm putting the same effort into both, and it's tough. But at the same time, if you started with Chinese, I do feel like there's going to be some things you'll see in Japanese that reminds you of your Chinese studies, or that you can say, oh, I can see the Chinese influence that, or that's a lot like Chinese. And that'll make your Japanese study easier. And then on the flip side, guys, look, if you're like, what if I've studied Japanese first? Am I going to see these going the opposite way from Chinese? I can't totally speak to that because I'm coming from the Chinese studying that first and then Japanese side, but I think you would see a lot of the same things. The kanji crossover goes both directions. The particles would go both directions. I think I actually think the biggest challenge going from Japanese to Chinese is there's two things. The first thing going from Japanese to Chinese, at least I think the biggest challenge from Japanese to Chinese, so let me kind of go answer this part now. So the biggest challenge going from Japanese to Chinese, I think would just be having to emphasize more on pronunciation, having to get used to tones, right? So there's pitch accent in Japanese, but you got to worry about tones now in Chinese. And so that means, so for example, like a first tone is like, let me just do an example again. So like, ma, 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 ma. Okay, those mean 4 different things right there, okay? And so just getting used to tone and the high flat tone, the rising tone, the low rising tone, and then the dropping tone, having to use the tones, that's going to be a challenge going from Japanese into Chinese. And then also, too, as well, I think if you start with Japanese, depending on where your level is at, you may have kind of pushed off kanji a little bit and just focus on hiragana and katakana and kind of said, I'll worry about kanji later. In Chinese, you can't dodge kanji because that's all that there is. That's all there is. And that's usually viewed as like the hardest part of Japanese is learning kanji. And guess what? In Chinese, that's all that they use. There's no training. There's like no like training modes. Like Taiwan has this thing called Juyin. That's like kind of like their version of hiragana or hiragana/katakana. But those are only used for like children to help them learn the characters. So I mean, you could communicate with Juyin, but it's just like no one does it. And in Taiwan, they use traditional characters there, so it's even harder. They use the same characters the Japanese does. So one thing I will say though about learning Japanese is if you learn Japanese kanji really well, then go into Chinese, because Japanese typically uses the traditional kanji. Then if you want to learn traditional Chinese, I think learning Japanese would help with that. So that's one positive thing. But if you haven't been studying kanji super hard, like you're gonna have to get used to kanji much more in Chinese because all they use, I mean, the pronunciation's even more so that way with the tones. But what would definitely be easier for you going from Japanese to Chinese is the grammar is much simpler in Chinese. You don't have verb conjugations in Chinese, and that's super nice. That's super nice. And then as far as like kind of going the opposite direction, so I think going from Chinese to Japanese, the biggest challenge, definitely. I mean, first of all, having to like learn hiragana and katakana is tough. Like that's initially, cause it's just like, okay, you gotta learn these alphabetical scripts, but it's, you know, once you get those down, it's not that bad because there's not as many kanji, there's not as many. You can use hiragana and katakana to communicate more on the front end, so that part seems easier. Oh, there's an alphabet that kind of break it up. It's not just walls of kanji, so that makes it easier, I think, come from the Chinese side. And then the other big thing coming from the Chinese side of the Japanese side, but initially that makes it tougher because you gotta learn two different scripts, right? So that initially makes it tougher. But definitely the biggest challenge coming from Chinese to Japanese that I've learned and studied, definitely just is the fact that Japanese grammar is a lot more complicated than Chinese grammar. So Chinese grammar is really simple. It's really simple. Like Chinese grammar is really, that's like the one part of Chinese that's easy, is the grammar is super easy. Like there's almost like, I don't want to say there's no Chinese grammar because there is Chinese grammar, but like it's kind of a running joke that it's like, oh, there's like no Chinese grammar. Whereas in Japanese has verb conjugations and is more complex grammatically. There's actual grammar rules. So if you've studied something like Spanish, for example, like that will definitely apply, that kind of thing applies to Japanese as well. So those are some of the differences right there that I think if you're going from one to the other, you'll find to be difficult. But yeah, definitely, I do think that if you've learned Chinese and studied Chinese, I think it'll definitely help you with your Japanese studies. And then, you know, vice versa as well. I think if you started with Japanese and you're just doing Chinese, I think you'll find some similarities there as well. So hopefully this video helps at least one person that's interested in this topic. And if you're interested in connecting with me on social media, my handle on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram is slamdunk406. And I'll leave a description of that, and I'll leave that in the description. And then if you're interested in my channel and you like this kind of stuff and you're interested in what to say on this kind of topic, I also do piano videos and whatnot, some Michael Jackson stuff as well. So if that kind of stuff interests you, definitely feel free to subscribe to my channel. Really would appreciate that. And that's all I have to say. I'll catch you guys in the next video. Have a good one. Peace.